Hey there, extra historians. Welcome to Lies, the part of the show where we tell you all the stuff we left out, all the things we got wrong, and all the emperors we shaved. I'm Rob Rath. I'm the head writer of Extra History, and today we're talking about Japanese militarism. This was a really cool series. I'm going to get really quick through this because this episode is going to be like practically all Ibn Battuta's side trips. So recommended reading for this series is A History of Japan with R.H.P. Mason and J.G. Caiger, The Rising Sun by John Toland, The Making of Modern Japan by Marius R. Jansen. I'd like to recommend a couple of museums, the Hiroshima Peace Museum in Japan, the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas. It's weird that it's there. It's Admiral Nimitz's hometown, that's why. And it started out of the Admiral Nimitz Museum. National World War II Museum in New Orleans, which has some excellent galleries about the Pacific War, and Museum of Coastal Defense in Hong Kong, if you're here in Hong Kong with me. First of all, just thank you to our patrons who voted for this series, which I wanted to do so badly, even before I was working on the show. And we are associated with CuriosityStream and Nebula. If you want to watch a CuriosityStream documentary about this subject, Apocalypse World War II is on that service. And we are partners with Nebula. We have a special episode on the Tipu Sultan over on Nebula. I wanted to add a personal note. We're kind of doing Ibn Battuta's side trip up front this time. I've wanted to do a series or do something about this topic for a long time. I've lived on battlefields of the Pacific War for the majority of my life. I'm from Kaneohe, Hawaii, which it was the first place hit during the Pearl Harbor attack. My grandfather was actually at Pearl Harbor as a civilian oil worker fighting fires and preparing the oil terminal for what they thought at that time was going to be an amphibious invasion. And I now live in Hong Kong, which at the same time was invaded at the same time as the Pearl Harbor attack. I literally live in a battlefield. Like, when I take my kid to play, it's like, well, there's a bunker, and that's where a massacre happened. And so I've lived with sort of the legacies of this conflict for a long time, just being around me and being aware of them. And I never really got what I felt was a satisfying answer to how did this part of the war start? How did we get here? The same way that documentaries were going out of their way to talk about the rise of Nazism in Germany, they just didn't ever seem to pay the same amount of attention to Japan and the rise of militarism. And I didn't totally notice this until I was at the National Museum of the Pacific War about 10 years ago, I would say, and there was just this massive gallery on how did the Pacific War start. And, you know, the first event was Admiral Perry's arrival in Japan and the opening of Japan, and it just laid it out so clearly of like, this was events in the 19th century led directly to this. And it had never really occurred to me that way. And just seeing it laid out like that, I was like, why was I never told this before? And I didn't see these connections before. And I really realized that most documentaries and even a lot of books really just start the Pacific War at Pearl Harbor and are kind of like, yeah, well, all this stuff happened in China. And, you know, there was the rise of militarism in Japan and resources and, you know, that kind of thing. But it never really got the same gritty detail and talk about the liberal and conservative parties in the same way that they did for Nazi Germany. It's just sort of been like, well, you know, everyone in Japan, you know, worship emperor, kind of all, you know, thinking the same thing, which is absolutely not true, as I hope you will have seen when you watched our series. And I was very retroactively upset at how I had been taught the Pacific War when I realized this, and I wanted to do some kind of historical work that involved kind of telling an alternate narrative of this. I also want to do it because I think we're a little like over-obsessed with Nazism and the rise of Nazi Germany. There were other examples of fascist governments, and we should also look at them, partially because just knowing a broader amount about the rise of authoritarianism, you know, forewarns and forearms us in different ways. And not everything is going to look like German fascism, because the world is much more varied than that. So I think it's also just important to know more more and sort of broaden our historical interest. How did we do the series? So I wanted to do the series, but how are we going to do it? It was a very hard series to do, partially because there's no central figure in the same way there is for Hitler and Mussolini that Japanese militarism is built around. There are a lot of different hands in it. So it was very clear at the beginning it was going to be a big series, it was going to be a complicated series, and I realized early on that we were not going to be able to talk in real depth about things like Japanese colonialism in Korea. I kind of created a carve-out for that, where I was like, well, I would rather do that in a series about Korean history where we could look at Korean perspectives, we could go back to 1910 and the murder of the Empress of Korea. And that's a very important part of this story, but I tried to get the necessary information, but then also, have that be sort of a separate part that maybe we could take on in a series in the future. It also, some of the big massacres like the Nanjing Massacre, that would have taken up, to really do that properly, it would have taken an entire episode, and at that point we didn't have the time. So that's another future thing, possibly. So I basically made this artificial division where we're talking about internal Japanese militarism, and we're sort of not talking so much about imperialism, which is a very artificial division. I just want to be very upfront about that. But it was the way that we could concentrate on kind of the domestic causes of this, in the same way that you would look at the rise of Nazi Germany. I also didn't want to look too much into how much Hirohito was at fault. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is, much like discussing Japanese atrocities in Korea and China, I thought that if we started getting into it, it would just become, that section would become bigger and bigger until it started taking over the series, and we'd get a little unfocused. The second thing is that, so most of what we know about the Imperial Circle, it's a very closed world, and most of that comes from debriefings of Hirohito by American occupation authorities. So a lot of that story is just told by Hirohito, and we kind of take his word for it or don't. And at that point, it was after the war, and he was very clearly trying to avoid blame for what had happened. So a lot rests on how much you believe him or how much you don't. And that was a thing that I did not feel like we could fully wrestle with in the context of a 5-episode series on Japanese militarism. Where I landed was, I was very comfortable saying that if he had stepped up more, he probably could have prevented a lot of sorrow for East Asia in general, and his country too. So that's kind of where I landed on it, without having to get too into wrestling with whether the war was his fault or could he have done more. I think he could have done more, and I think I felt very solid saying that. But whether he was personally egging things on, I didn't want to get into that. So general stuff. Patron question from Gotya Gaming YT. Did Japanese militarism impact or cause the Showa Restoration, and how was the restoration impacted by militarism? So the Showa Restoration is a term that is used by particularly the Imperial Wei faction of putting Hirohito in charge of the Japanese government. This was their objective with the February 26th incident, right, the uprising in Tokyo. So they fail in this, partially because the emperor doesn't want that. But I think what actually you're talking about is the American occupation authorities allowing the imperial family to continue to exist after the war. That was something that MacArthur in particular was very interested in, because he thought it would lead to greater stability for Japan in the long term and prevent a slide back into militarism, if there was a figurehead still, that there was some continuity of state that didn't have a lot of political power. And as a result, a lot of kind of branches of the imperial family are sheared off and become commoners, but kind of the nuclear imperial family stays. So yes, it's related to militarism because it was thought that this would prevent militarism from coming back. Patron question from WSG. Did Japanese soldiers defect to the Chinese and Australian military? My great-grandfather was in the Australian military. I didn't find anything about Australian militaries, but I did. This was an interesting question, because the Communist 8th Route Army, the Chinese Communist 8th Route Army, when it would capture Japanese soldiers or discover Japanese deserters, It would basically be like, you could go back to your unit, or you could go to this anti-fascist school that we created that will kind of like deprogram you and make you a part of our cause. And there were around 300 Japanese soldiers that actually went and became part of propaganda efforts by Chinese communists and like helped them out on the front line. So yeah, you did have Japanese defectors going off and joining the Chinese forces, which is it's a very interesting thing that you don't hear about all that much. So they had some limited success with this. Patron question from Marina de Moras. Could you talk about Bushido as a philosophy and how it related to the process of militarization in Japan? This is super interesting. I'm very glad you asked this because I had to cut out a section on this. So Bushido was not a universal code of morals or ethics in Japan. It was more structured around valorous actions, but it changed heavily from place to place, from family line to family line. Everyone kind of had this different idea of what it was. It's really an umbrella term rather than a specific thing. But there was a Japanese writer named Tobe Yanazo who left Japan at age 18, and in 1900 he writes this book called Bushido, the Soul of Japan, and it's based on family stories and kind of his memories of Japanese culture because he's been out for over a decade at that point, and he's had his entire adult education be in English in the West. There's some in Germany as well. And he writes this book in English for a Western audience, and it becomes hugely popular after the Russo-Japanese War and is this like way of understanding the Japanese character, like Theodore Roosevelt reads it and things like that. Then it gets translated into Japanese and becomes a bestseller in Japan, where Japanese people are learning, they think about like this authentic Bushido code, and it's gone through these multiple filters. And a lot of Japanese scholars at that time are like, this is trash. Like, this is not a good book. Like, it doesn't really understand it. Like, it's through a Western lens. It's like kind of conflating it with European chivalry in a way that doesn't really make sense. But it becomes popular, particularly among militarists, as like, and it shapes this idea of what Bushido is and what a Japanese warrior should be. Episode 1. I have to apologize for a guns mistake, which is I actually caught it, and we used muzzleloading rifles probably like 2 episodes later than we should. At the beginning of episode 1, we would be using them, but we should be using them, but they should have changed to bolt-action rifles. They were changed in some frames, they were not changed in others. I'm going to blame this one on me proofing some of these episodes and writing some of the later episodes when I was doing a 21-day hotel quarantine to get back into Hong Kong with my 2-year-old and my 3-month-old. So I was pretty underslept, and I made some mistakes. So blame me. Patron question from Peanut Tree. Why wasn't the Prime Minister guarded on a public train station? Did the assassin get away, or did the bystanders stop him? This seems crazy to us now, but like big security details for heads of state is a relatively new thing. The assassin did not get away. He was later released during the war, as almost like he was a political prisoner, ended up dying in the 1970s. But like, consider President McKinley, who was shot by an anarchist because he was just like, people had lined up to shake hands with him, and one of those guys had a gun, like nobody was frisked or searched. Or President Garfield, who shot on his porch. Big security for heads of state is a relatively new thing, and isn't a thing universally. You go to some European countries and like the Prime Minister is just like walking around. He doesn't have that many guards or anything. Patron question from Hercules. You mentioned that the 1905 Russo-Japanese War was the first time an Asian power defeated a European empire, but there were other times where that happened, specifically the 1866 French expedition to Korea, the United States Formosa expedition to Taiwan in 1867, or the Philippine Revolution. So why this special attention on the 1905 Russo-Japanese War in particular? So those first 2 examples are not actual wars, they're punitive expeditions. So it's a small number of ships. It's 7 for the French, 2 for the Americans. The number of casualties on each side is single digits. And these are punitive expeditions, they're not wars. It's the idea is like, we're going to send some ships over and bombard a coastline. So it's low commitments. It's not a real like one-on-one military conflict. As for the Philippine Revolution, that is a good example, but it's part of the Spanish-American War. So you have the United States fighting the Spanish Empire, and the United States kind of tacitly allied with Philippine rebels. So they're not formally allied, but the United States and what it's doing to the Spanish is very much helping Philippine independence movements. So it's not really a one-on-one conflict. So this was the first like head-to-head like government versus government war. YouTube question, no mention of the failed assassination attempt known as the Otsu incident. This was a failed assassination attempt in Japan of the man who had become Nicholas II, Tsar of Russia, in 1891. I feel like this would make a good one-off episode. It's an interesting thing that it doesn't have a lot of connection to militarism, so that's why it's not part of our series. Episode 2, patron question from Benjamin Rubin. There's been a recent trend to downplay or deny the massacre of Koreans after the 1923 earthquake. There's the Great Kanto earthquake. For example, a current mayor of Tokyo for several years refused to send a yearly eulogy in memory of the massacre, and that had previously been customary. Why is that, and what can be done to combat it? Why is that? A lot of countries like to ignore bad things that happened in their past. We currently have a debate going on in the United States about what is appropriate to teach to students about like the history of slavery and the history of race massacres. I was well into adulthood before I knew about the Tulsa Race Massacre. I think the best way to counteract that is to do popular history about events like this and mention it. And people start asking, why don't I know this? Who decided that this was not a thing that was going to be taught to me? So to me, that's the best way. Patron question from Arjun Kapoor. Why did the Japanese not take any land in their intervention during the Russian Civil War? Wasn't Vladivostok an important port? The militarists wanted to. They really wanted to. And actually, the Zaibatsu, the corporations, moved tens of thousands of civilian Japanese workers to Vladivostok and started setting up factories with the idea that they might just set up a buffer state here, like they, would later do in Manchuria. But due to political pressure, this didn't end up happening. The civilian government decided to pull out, and the military was really unhappy about it. So, yeah, the militaries very badly wanted to set up a state in Siberia. Another YouTube commenter mentioned that the area we identified as Siberia is actually the Russian Far East. We're using historical terms that don't necessarily map to modern terms and Japanese terms that don't necessarily match to current Russian terms, so that's why. A bunch of people mentioned that we used blue to represent the liberal side of the spectrum in Japanese politics and red for the conservative side of the spectrum. In most of the rest of the world, it is the opposite. Red are often the liberals, blue are often the conservatives, and we were doing this from a very American perspective. That's absolutely true. Someone commented, and I thought this was great, shouldn't the communists be red? Good point. We'll consider that in the future. Episode 3, patron question from Aaron Walker. Did Emperor Taisho's mental health play any role in his decisions or the government's decisions? In general, it's thought so, or just his lack of presence that allowed democracy to really grow and take over, and for society to develop without a very steady imperial hand. He contracted cerebral meningitis as a baby, possibly because the wet nurse who nursed him used a lot of lead-based cosmetics. He had neurological problems throughout his life. He had trouble with manual dexterity. He seemed to have some impaired mental states and possibly some intellectual disability, which worsened as he got older. He was really good at languages, so, take that as you will. Supposedly, when he went to the opening of the 1913 Imperial Diet, he took his speech that was rolled up and started looking through it at lawmakers like a spyglass. He was 34 at the time. He was not often seen in public as a result. YouTube question. It seems that disillusionment with democracy is something Japan had in common with Germany before World War II. I'd love to hear your take on the similarities and differences. I think there are both similarities and differences. I do think resentment is a major commonality, but it's a different kind of resentment. Germany is on the losing side of World War I and has things like, indemnities and, is economically very badly impacted by the Treaty of Versailles. Japan feels like it is not allowed to take part in the spoils in the way other nations have. So both times it's resentment against other countries, but it's a different flavor of resentment. It's Japan feeling like it's being kept out of the club, despite the fact that it's one of the victors. And in Germany, it's more that it's being like beaten up on and unfairly blamed for the war. Also, Japan does not have an internal minority like the Jews who are being blamed. So that's a major, major difference. Someone pointed out that in the Asuka period to the end of the Heian period, the emperor was actually in charge, the head of state, but it was ostensibly, he was mostly in control of factions. Yes, exactly. The emperor is very rarely actually in control of all of Japan in the way people liked to imagine he was. Someone said, props to your artists. The details are great on the 1920s vibe. Yes, our artists are fantastic. Nick did a wonderful job on this series, particularly on the details of the 1920s period. I thought that was great. Episode 4, is Genkokujo really a Japanese thing? I don't actually think so. There is sometimes a feeling that because Japan or China has a specific term for something, and a lot of languages in the West don't, that it's a culturally specific thing. I think this idea of, well, I don't like what he did, but I understand why he did it. I think this is actually quite common in very politically polarized societies. You see the same thing being said at like lynching trials in the South. People get off because of like, well, obviously it's not good to do that kind of thing, but they deserved it, you know? It's a very common defense actually in Wild West trials for murder. Essentially like, well, I mean, the victim's a drifter and the guy who did it is a grocer and the drifter was kind of causing trouble. So that guy needed killing and someone was going to do it eventually and we're not going to lose our grocer over it, you know? So I think it's a much more common thing than we would necessarily like to admit. I don't think it's culturally specific to Japan. There may be elements that are specific, but I think the phenomenon in general is something you will see quite a bit. YouTube question. The guy at 3:10 of episode 4, he has glasses and a mustache. Is that supposed to be Tojo Hideki? No. One thing that was mind-blowing to me about this series is how late Prime Minister Tojo comes in, right? You see him on old World War II propaganda posters from the American side where it's like Hitler and Mussolini and Tojo, and you just sort of assume that he has this central role in the development of Japanese militarism like Hitler and Mussolini do. He absolutely does not. He's an army officer in Manchuria. He ends up heading the Kwantung Army in 1937. He's brought in as Minister of War in 1940, and he's a big proponent of a preemptive strike on the American forces in Hawaii. And as a result, he ends up swept into the role of Prime Minister in October of 1941. So he's like barely gotten his seat warm before Yamamoto strikes Pearl Harbor, which is just mind-blowing to me. And of course, he's ousted in 1944. So he absolutely does not have like this central role where we're like, we're going to tell the story of Japanese militarism with Tojo in the middle of it. Like, one of the reasons that this is a harder story to tell is there's not this central rallying figure. So I just thought that was amazing, that I never totally knew that. Episode 5, patron question from Hercules. Basically, he was saying that he felt we glossed over the horror of the Nanjing Massacre. Yeah, I mentioned this earlier, but it's one of those things that you can't really go into that a little bit, in my feeling. To really treat it with the respect it deserves, you kind of have to basically say, and then this happened, and, you know, I really felt like we could either say, then this happened, and we all know it was bad, and then move on to deal with it in a greater detail at some other point, or we could devote like an entire episode to it, which I knew we couldn't afford in this 5-episode series. So that's why. YouTube question. I'm curious, and I hope this will be explained in Lies. Is there any reason Hirohito is drawn without glasses and his mustache? Yes. So when we first show Hirohito, he is crown prince. It's before he's grown his mustache, and he's not wearing glasses in public yet. And we ended up just keeping that model throughout the series. I probably should have put a mustache on him. I'm going to argue for not putting glasses on him in later episodes because I wanted to break that idea of the kind of round glasses and mustache kind of propaganda image of him. People who wear glasses don't wear glasses all the time, especially in private and at home. So I thought that was an interesting way to kind of get around some like mental images that we've formed about this period. Coming up on Extra History, Empire of Brazil. This was a really cool series. I didn't know anything about it going in. It was fascinating to research. I needed a little palate cleanser after all that slavery from Empire of Brazil and all these assassinations and mob violence in the Japanese Militarism series. What's a better palate cleanser than beer? We're doing the history of beer, and it's going to be a lot of fun. After that, your vote. We have 4 topics: Tulip Mania, the Reign of Terror in France, the Bar Kokhba Revolt, which is the last of the Jewish-Roman Wars, and the Catharist Heresy and development of the Inquisition. As always, keep an eye out. You never know when we'll drop a sponsored episode. We just did one on Gotz of the Iron Hand, the German cyborg mercenary knight. And we're not going to do an Ibn Battuta side trip because I feel like we did so many Ibn Battuta side trips already. We did them up front. So, see you next time for the History of Brazil. Bye.
A legendary thanks to Ahmed Ziad Turk, Alicia Bramble, Casey Mustia, Dominic Valenciana, Joseph Blame, Kyle Murgatroyd, Kyle Wildridge, and O'Reels 1.